presentation. So this talk's going to be a little bit less directly related to health security, I think, than all the talks yesterday. I didn't actually know what health security was until John's talk yesterday, but I am going to talk about a problem, the dual use problem, which I think has some kind of indirect bearing on questions about health security, and I hope that will kind of become obvious as I go along. So I'm going to begin by briefly saying what the dual use problem is, as I'm going to understand it. And a lot of you probably already know this. Some people in the room know much more about it than I do, I think, but maybe some don't. And it is a problem that's been understood in several different ways, so it will probably be helpful to clarify what I'm talking about. Okay, so a number of nuclear physicists working in the early and middle parts of last century took them to be faced with themselves to be faced with an ethical quandary. I mean, they knew that their work could be used in good ways, for example, in beneficial power generation projects and medical applications. But they're also, of course, aware that it could be used in what they took to be bad ways, for example, in unjustified nuclear attacks. And in quite a few cases, the physicists thought that the risk that their work would be used in bad ways, or misused, as we're going to say from now on, was kind of sufficiently serious that it wasn't really clear whether they even should be doing that work, or whether they should be disseminating its results. So these are two physicists who were involved in the Manhattan Project, which was the US government project during the Second World War that resulted in the development of the nuclear bomb, and they were both, as well as a number of other members of the project, kind of expressed ambivalence about really whether they ought to be doing what they were doing. And so more recently it's been suggested that similar kinds of quandaries have arisen in various areas of the life sciences, and John already alluded to some of these yesterday. Particularly the worries have been raised in relation to synthetic biology and some other parts of virology and microbiology, and probably the kind of highest profile recent case where people have said that a similar quandary arises involves these two scientists, two flu researchers, whose research teams in the US and the Netherlands kind of independently discovered ways of making the H5N1 virus transmissible by air between ferrets. And ferrets are a model for humans in flu research, so the kind of worry was that they had also perhaps made the virus transmissible by air between humans. They submitted their papers to the journals Science and Nature, and those journals then kind of thought, oh, I'm not sure whether we should publish these studies in full. That could be used as kind of instructions on how to make an extra lethal version of the flu virus, which could be used in, say, a biological attack. And then they sought the advice of various kind of advisory agencies on what they should do about this. So we could think of these scientists or the agencies that had to advise on what the journals should do about this research, about whether to publish it or not, as faced with a similar quandary to that faced by the nuclear physicists. And that's a quandary that I'm going to call the dual use problem, and that is widely called the dual use problem or the dual use dilemma. Now, there's been a bit of debate about how we should understand this problem. I'm going to understand it simply as the ethical quandary arising when someone faces a choice regarding whether to promote the creation or dissemination of some piece of scientific knowledge, and that knowledge can be used in both good and bad ways. And the risk of bad use is sufficiently high, or sufficiently serious, I should really say. It could be a likely bad outcome, or it could be a very serious but unlikely bad outcome. Either way, the risk is sufficiently serious that it's unclear whether the agent ought to be promoting the creation or dissemination of that knowledge. Okay, so that's the kind of problem I'm going to be talking about. Now, as this problem has kind of generally been understood in the kind of recent literature, the bad use is normally thought to be a kind of offensive, kind of military-style use. So it's usually a worry about nuclear, chemical, or biological attack. That's the kind of bad use that people have been worried about. But a number of kind of people writing on this have thought, well, why don't we also include, for example, other kinds of threats to health security, say, other kinds of threats that involve from kind of what we might call misuse, but don't really necessarily involve any intention to inflict harm. So you might think of kind of a scientist who kind of negligently does research on some very lethal version of the flu virus without having proper biosafety procedures in place, and then that pathogen escapes into the community and causes an infection. Some people might want to include that within the kind of context of, within the definition of what's a bad use of scientific knowledge. And also, personally, I think there's no particular reason to limit it to kind of, even to kind of threats to security or health security. I mean, there are lots of different ways in which scientific knowledge could be used for bad ends. And I think that, at least from a philosophical point of view, the kind of structure of the problem is the same regardless of what the bad use is. So we could think of someone who's developing a drug that could be used both to treat a disease and to kind of used by sports people for illegal doping or something. That could also be an example of a dual use problem, as I would understand it, even though the kind of problem with doping in sport is obviously not anything to do with kind of threat to security. So that's the dual use problem. A couple of points about it. First thing is that the second kind of condition is obviously crucial, because almost every piece of scientific knowledge can be used in good and bad ways. But it's only kind of when the risk of bad use is sort of unusually high that people generally think that there's actually a serious question to be asked about whether this knowledge should be produced or whether it should be disseminated. The other kind of point to make about this way of thinking about the dual use problem is that it's a kind of problem that can arise not only for individual scientists, as in the kind of nuclear physics case that I started with, but also for anyone else who's basically in a position to kind of impede or promote scientific progress. So it could arise for policymakers, for journal editors, for the state, for the scientific community as a whole, for science funders, for universities, for example. So actually in the flu research case that I just gave, the scientists themselves didn't really think they were faced with any kind of ethical problem. They thought it was clear that the research that it was good to do the research and that it could be published in full. It was only really something like the NSABP, the advisory body in the biosecurity in the US, that thought there was actually a serious kind of ethical dilemma or problem here. Okay, so that's the dual use problem. I now want to spend basically the rest of the talk talking about one way in which a number of scientists have kind of tried to respond to this problem in cases where they've thought that they're faced with a problem or where other people have thought that they've been faced with this problem. So, I mean, you might think that if you're a scientist or anyone else kind of involved in promoting or impeding science, and you take yourself to be faced with a dual use problem, then you have some kind of burden of, some kind of deliberative burden. You have to address that problem in some way. You can't simply just kind of ignore it and go on doing what you would have done anyway. And there might seem to be two kind of obvious ways in which you could kind of address that burden. One is you could try to find some way to kind of escape from the problem by trying to find some way of preventing the bad uses of the scientific knowledge that you're trying to create without also foregoing the good uses. So suppose you're a flu researcher and you've developed some extra virulent or extra transmissible variant of the flu virus, and you might think, you're faced with a dilemma about whether to make this kind of knowledge that you've acquired widely available. Well, perhaps one way of kind of escaping from the problem would be to wait until someone has developed a kind of good defensive strategy against infection with this virus, and then you might think that the kind of dilemma or the problem will no longer arise because the risk of bad use will have been made less serious. So that's kind of one strategy. You might wait for some kind of technological or institutional solution to the problem, and then the problem may no longer arise. The obvious other way, of course, in which you might kind of think that you could kind of address the dual use problem is just by kind of confronting it as an ethicist would do, by doing some kind of moral deliberation and thinking about what should I do? What are the reasons in favour of trying to produce this knowledge or trying to disseminate this knowledge? What are the reasons against, and which kind of side of the argument is most powerful? But actually, as it happens, many scientists at least who have thought that they might be faced with a dual use problem or have been kind of deemed to be faced with a dual use problem by others have responded in neither of these ways. Rather, they've responded by kind of denying that they have any obligation to think about how their knowledge that they produce might be used, or what kind of social effects the scientific knowledge that they're producing or disseminating might have. And typically they haven't kind of stated the view as broadly as that, but many scientists have made kind of claims that kind of seem to suggest that this is kind of what they think. They think that they shouldn't really have to think about the kind of social utility of the knowledge that they produce. So I'm just going to give a couple of examples. There are many examples I could give here. So this is Robert Oppenheimer, who was the head of the Manhattan Project that I mentioned earlier. I think this is something he said in his 50s at some point. He was challenged about whether the Manhattan Project was really a good thing. And part of his response was to say this: when you see something that is technically sweet, you go ahead and do it, and you argue about what to do about it only after you've had your technical success. Now, taking at face value, that's just a purely descriptive claim about what scientists do. It's not a moral claim about what they ought to do. But I think that given the kind of context of responding to criticism, or these questions being asked about the ethics of the Manhattan Project, it's kind of reasonable to interpret this as a kind of disguised moral claim before this is what scientists should do, at least what they're kind of morally permitted to do. Similarly, this is Alvin Weinberg, who was the head of a major nuclear physics laboratory in the US in the middle of the 20th century. He said that we've all made a fustian bargain to accept the benefits of science and technology in exchange for the risks. And again, looks potentially like a purely descriptive claim, but given the kind of context in which the claim is made, you might think this is really an attempt to kind of say, look, we have made this bargain and we ought to stick to it. We ought to just kind of accept that overall science and technology is going to have positive effects, and not get down to thinking about whether in individual cases that's going to be true. So I think that these claims and a number of others could be interpreted basically in this way. The claim could be in deciding whether to promote the creation or dissemination of some piece of scientific knowledge, the likely effects of doing so on social utility, however you want to define that, social good, may permissibly be ignored. And I'm going to call that claim scientific isolationism, because it kind of says that science is in some way morally isolated from the rest of society. I don't think that's the best term, because it has various connotations that mean something quite different. If anyone can think of a better term, please let me know, but that's the term I'm using for the moment. So it's maybe worth saying that this claim hasn't only been defended by those who are kind of faced with dual use problems or faced with challenges due to how their research might be used in negative ways. It's also a kind of claim that many have held to in trying to justify engaging in kind of pure sciences that don't have any kind of obvious applications at all, whether positive or negative. So it's often used to kind of defend blue skies research. So here's an example of being used in this way by Marie Curie. So this is from a public lecture. She said scientific work must be considered from the point of view, must not be considered from the point of view of the direct usefulness of it. It must be done for itself, for the beauty of science, and then there's always the chance that a scientific discovery may become like the radium, a benefit for humanity. So this seems to be kind of actually defending maybe a very strong version of what I call scientific isolationism. She doesn't just seem to be saying that scientists are permitted to ignore how the research will be used. She seems to be saying that they ought to kind of ignore how it will be used. But she's not here thinking about the dual use problem. She's thinking about people who say you should be doing more applied research, not this kind of pure research. Okay, but so I think this claim kind of has fairly widespread support, at least among scientists, and not just in relation to the dual use problem. But for the rest of this talk, I'm just going to focus on the relevance of this claim, scientific isolationism, for the dual use problem. So basically, I want to ask, is this claim actually justified, and is it justified in any form that would be useful to those who wish to appeal to this view to try to escape from dual use problems? And my kind of argumentative strategy is going to be to first kind of set up a presumption against scientific isolationism. I want to try and argue that the default position should be that this view is not justified. And then I want to consider some arguments, 4 arguments. I might have time only to consider 3. And in favour of scientific isolationism, 3 arguments sort of against just accepting this default position. And some of them are arguments for scientific isolationism as I've presented it, some of the arguments for kind of slightly weaker variants of that view. Okay, so let's start with the kind of presumption against scientific isolationism. So this is pretty simple, I'm not going to spend much time on it. Basically, it relies on drawing a parallel between scientific knowledge and any other kind of tool that can be used in both good and bad ways. So for pretty much any other kind of tool that you can think of that has both positive and negative, desirable and undesirable applications, we think that the kind of people who produce that tool or who distribute that tool should think about its kind of effects on social utility, at least in cases where the kind of risk of bad use seems to be kind of high. So think of weapons are probably the obvious example. Most people think that arms manufacturers and arms distributors should think about how the kinds of weapons that they're making might be used, what they should think about who they're selling the weapon to and how that particular person might want to use the weapon. That would be a kind of standard view about the ethics of arms manufacturing, maybe not among arms manufacturers themselves, but amongst pretty much everyone else. And certainly we would think that, that governments that are in a position to regulate the arms trade or arms sales or arms manufacturing should be thinking about how those weapons might be used, and that they should take that in mind into consideration in forming policy. So you might think weapons are kind of a special case because they have such obvious possible kind of negative applications, and maybe fewer possible positive applications than scientific knowledge. But I think that this kind of view applies to other kinds of things as well. So I think we would take a similar view about those who manufacture components that can be used to produce weapons, but can also be used in some entirely kind of non-military way. Things like cars, nail guns, toxic chemicals that, again, that are usually produced not with any particularly negative application in mind, where we think that the people who make and sell these things should kind of try to make them or distribute them in such a way that they're less likely to be used in bad ways. And this, I think, kind of creates a presumption in favour of the rejection of scientific isolationism. In the absence of any reason to think that scientific knowledge is something special, why don't we just think of it in the same way as any other tool that can be used in both good and bad ways? So that's all I'm going to say about the kind of argument against scientific isolationism. And now I want to start thinking about some arguments that people might give in favour of it. And as I say, there are 4 arguments that I want to try to consider. So the first argument appeals to the kind of intrinsic value of scientific knowledge, and this might be something that we think distinguishes scientific knowledge from many other tools that can be used in good and bad ways. You might think that scientific knowledge kind of has intrinsic value, it's valuable in itself, irrespective of how it's likely to be used. And certainly this is a claim that's often made kind of in conjunction with expressions of scientific isolationism. So how would this kind of be an argument for scientific isolationism? Well, I guess the view would be scientific knowledge has intrinsic value, and it's the intrinsic value of scientific knowledge that determines whether it's justified to produce that knowledge or to disseminate that knowledge. So it would kind of be superfluous to start thinking about how that knowledge is likely to be used, what kind of effects it's likely to have on social utility, because all we need to think about is this knowledge intrinsically valuable, or is it intrinsically valuable enough to be worth spending scientific resources trying to produce it or disseminate it. But I think this argument faces a kind of fairly obvious problem, which is that even if you think that scientific knowledge has intrinsic value, it's not kind of straightforwardly following that we should just ignore what instrumental value or disvalue it might also have in virtue of how it will be used. So, the natural thing to conclude from the claim that knowledge has scientific knowledge has intrinsic value would be this is one value that we should take into account in thinking about the ethics of producing or disseminating knowledge, but it's not a reason to kind of ignore the kind of other kinds of value or disvalue that knowledge might have. And the natural thing would be to think we should just consider all of these values together. I think the only way that this argument could really succeed is if we thought that the kind of intrinsic value of scientific knowledge was a kind of trumping value, a kind of value that lexically dominates all other kinds of values. And that just seems to be highly implausible. If the value of scientific knowledge, the intrinsic value of scientific knowledge, was a Trump value, then we would not be justified in spending any money on promoting health or educating people or doing anything else that we think is a worthwhile activity, except insofar as it would promote the creation of intrinsically valuable scientific knowledge, and that's obviously, I think, an implausible view. So I don't think this argument is very persuasive, despite the fact that it's kind of very commonly mentioned in support of scientific isolationism. So let's consider now the second argument, and this appeals to the kind of problem of uncertainty. So the dual-use problem is kind of a very difficult problem to address, in part because there's so much uncertainty actually about how scientific knowledge is likely to be used. And in fact, if we're thinking about questions about whether to create scientific knowledge rather than questions about whether to disseminate it, then there's usually great uncertainty at the point of beginning a scientific project about what knowledge that project will actually end up producing. So scientists might set out with a particular hypothesis, but of course there's lots of accidental discoveries in science. If it's a good scientific project, the scientists won't actually know whether the hypothesis is going to be true or false, or supported or not supported by the research. So there's uncertainty about what kind of knowledge a scientific project will produce. There's uncertainty about how that knowledge will be used by others. And then of course there's uncertainty about what the effects of those uses will be. So there's kind of huge uncertainty in trying to think about the dual use problem, and that's part of what makes it very difficult to kind of confront the problem just by kind of weighing the arguments for and against. And again, this is something that's often mentioned in support of scientific isolationism. Scientists needn't think about the kinds of social utility of the knowledge that they're trying to produce or disseminate it, because there's just too much uncertainty for them to do that in any kind of meaningful way. Okay, but noting that there's great uncertainty, it doesn't kind of automatically follow from that we shouldn't try to kind of predict as well as we can, how scientific knowledge will be used and kind of make decisions accordingly. So let's think about how this kind of claim about uncertainty might be developed into something like an argument in favour of scientific isolationism. So the first possibility would be to argue that there's so much uncertainty that it's completely futile to try to determine the social utility of a piece of scientific knowledge. Our predictions will be no better than random. This, I think, is just kind of an implausibly strong claim. I mean, it involves kind of thinking that we have no evidence at all in advance about how a particular piece of scientific knowledge might be used. That just doesn't seem right. If you're engaged in a project that's trying to make, say, the flu virus more virulent or more transmissible, and there's a kind of, let's suppose, some military group of some sort has already expressed an interest in trying to do this and trying to use this virus in a kind of unjustified way. It's kind of fairly clear that gives you some reason to think, so there's kind of some evidence for the view that this research might be particularly prone to misuse compared to some other completely innocuous kind of medical research, for example. So, I mean, I think it's just kind of implausible that we have knowledge of a possible mechanism of how something might be used, knowledge of motivations of people to want to kind of use a piece of scientific knowledge in a problematic way, has no evidential value whatsoever. Maybe a more plausible version of the argument would be to say, look, it's not that trying to predict how scientific knowledge will be used is completely futile. It's just that it's kind of very hard to kind of make any kind of accurate predictions. So the benefits of kind of engaging in kind of any kind of social utility analysis in relation to scientific knowledge will be fairly minimal, because there'll always be a lot of uncertainty about whether we've really got the analysis correct. On the other hand, the costs of trying to engage in this analysis will be high. It would be very kind of difficult to think about these problems, partly because of the concerns about uncertainty. So the argument might just be, it's not really worth the effort to think about, to try to engage in predicting how scientific knowledge will be used, because the benefits are restricted and the kinds of deliberative burden is pretty high. But I think this kind of argument it probably relies on an assumption that if we reject scientific isolationism, we'll have to kind of have some view like that scientists have to be constantly engaging in some kind of explicit cost-benefit analysis of how their research might be used. And that would obviously be very burdensome, and that would kind of get in the way of a lot of scientific progress if scientists had to be constantly thinking about how their knowledge might be used in this kind of very explicit utilitarian calculus kind of way. But I don't think that rejecting scientific isolationism commits one to anything like that kind of view. You could think, for example, that scientists could just rely largely on intuition or on simple kind of heuristics to think about the risks that their work will be misused. For example, is there an obvious mechanism that by which my research will be misused? If yes, that's kind of reason to think it might be especially prone to misuse. Has some terrorist group or some military group with a bad track record expressed an interest in using this kind of knowledge? Again, that might be a reason to be concerned about misuse. Also, we might be able to outsource a lot of this kind of thinking about the risks of scientific research. It might be that we could have some expert body that advises scientists on these matters, so it's not the case that scientists themselves have to be constantly weighing risks and benefits. So, I mean, these are just some reasons to think that thinking that scientists have some kind of responsibility to think about how their research might be misused isn't necessarily kind of committing ourselves to any very kind of burdensome cost-benefit analysis on the part of scientists, which I think kind of undermines this argument. Okay, so I've considered two arguments that I think are probably the most kind of plausible arguments for scientific isolationism as I've presented it so far. But I now want to think about whether some weaker version of scientific isolationism might be plausible. So as I presented scientific isolationism earlier, it's a view that applies to everyone. It applies to scientists, but it applies to anyone else who might be faced with a dual-use problem as well. A health policy maker, science policy maker, a science funder, a journal editor, the vice-chancellor of the university, anyone. But you might think, well, when people like Oppenheimer and Weinberg were making these claims, they were really just talking about individual scientists. They weren't talking about those kind of institutional actors or powerful individuals that actually have an influence over what scientists do. They were just talking about scientists themselves. They were just saying scientists themselves shouldn't be worried about how their research will be used. They should be focused on kind of making scientific progress, satisfying curiosity. Basically, they should be focused on pursuing purely scientific aims. But perhaps other people, like science regulators or science funders, they should be thinking about how science will be used or misused, and they should be regulating science or deciding how to fund science accordingly. So this is a kind of restricted version of scientific isolationism that applies just to individual scientists. And I now want to think about whether that kind of view might be justified. I think I'm going to skip over this argument. So one argument might be that the reason that individual scientists shouldn't have to think about kind of how their research will be misused is that individual scientists don't actually have any kind of significant impact on the rate of scientific progress, the rate at which scientific knowledge is produced anyway. I think that argument isn't very promising. Happy to talk about in the Q&A. But I want to focus on the fourth argument, which I think is kind of the most interesting argument in this area. So this argument appeals to the idea of a division of moral labour, which is an idea that is probably familiar to the political philosophers in the room, because it was a prominent part of John Rawls's work in political philosophy. So the idea of a division of moral labour is that sometimes we can achieve our moral objectives more efficiently by assigning different kinds of responsibilities to different agents, rather than just giving everyone the same goal. So in Rawls's case, he was interested in how to achieve the goal of distributive justice, of having resources distributed justly across society. But he thought that we could achieve that goal more efficiently by giving certain responsibilities to those who design and maintain institutions, the basic institutions of our society, what he called the basic structure, and then assigning different kinds of principles to the individuals that are kind of going about their everyday lives within that institutional structure. So Rawls says, what we look for is an institutional division of labour between the basic structure and the rules applying directly to individuals and associations, and to be followed by them in particular transactions. If this division of labour can be established, individuals and associations are then left free to advance their ends more effectively within the framework of a basic structure, secure in the knowledge that elsewhere in the social system the necessary corrections to preserve background justice are being made. So we also thought we should have these kind of stringent principles of justice, like the difference principle that apply to those who are designing and maintaining institutions. But individual agents, like individual economic agents within the system, you didn't think that they should all be constantly thinking about how to make sure that the worst off person in society is as well off as possible. You didn't think that they should be applying the difference principle. You thought that they could basically just go about their everyday lives while the institutions of society ensured that the difference principle was satisfied. Okay, so actually, I mean, that's a kind of fancy political theory that invokes the idea of a division of moral labour, but actually we don't have to go anywhere near kind of political philosophy to sort of illustrate the division of moral labour. It's also a kind of idea that I think is implicit in much common sense thinking about capitalist market systems. So it's a kind of standard view of capitalism would be that governments should regulate capitalist markets so that they serve the public good, but individual economic agents within those markets are kind of free to kind of aggressively maximise their utility or profit within whatever regulatory framework the government sets. I'm not saying this is the right way to think about capitalism, but it's a common way of thinking about capitalism. So, I mean, consider a case where you have two corner store shop owners. One owner of the corner store shop decides to lower his prices, and that's kind of very harmful for the owner of the other shop because he no longer has any customers. This is a case of an agent inflicting great harm on another person, but we don't normally think that this is kind of as problematic as other ways that we harm one another, because we kind of think that there's this idea that within the framework of capitalism, people are kind of permitted to do things that would otherwise be morally problematic because the regulators of the system or the invisible hand or whatever are ensuring that the system kind of realises our moral objectives. At least that's the theory. Also many other kinds of examples of where we accept something like a division of moral labour. For example, in the law it's kind of standard to think that lawyers should act in the best interests of their clients, not kind of thinking about what will produce the most just outcome. And it's those who kind of design and uphold and run the legal system and the court system that should ensure that this kind of adversarial system leads to the best outcomes. Similarly, standard way of thinking about medicine would say that doctors should act in the interests of their own patients, and someone else, some regulatory body, should ensure that healthcare resources are allocated fairly between patients. It's not like doctors should constantly be thinking about the resource allocation implications of their decisions. They can leave that to regulatory authorities, and this is a kind of more efficient way of realising the objectives of medicine. So I hope I've convinced you that the division of moral labour is a kind of pretty commonplace idea in common sense moral thinking as well as in political philosophy. And hopefully it's kind of fairly easy to see how that could apply to scientific isolationism. So someone could say, well look, if we want to achieve the goals of science, which is to maybe produce intrinsically valuable scientific knowledge and to kind of promote social utility via this scientific knowledge, if we want to achieve those goals most efficiently, then we should have a system where scientists kind of aggressively pursue scientific goals, like creating new knowledge, satisfying their curiosity, testing kind of theoretically interesting hypotheses, and those who regulate science, those who fund science and so on, they should be the ones that kind of think about kind of nudging this kind of scientific enterprise so that it works most to the advantage of society. And the idea would be this is a division of moral responsibilities or moral labour that best promotes the public good, or best realises the values of science. So is this a good argument for scientific isolationism, or for at least the restricted version of it that applies only to individual scientists? Well, I think it might go some way towards justifying something kind of in the ballpark of scientific isolationism, but I just want to raise a couple of worries about the view. So the first worry is that this idea of achieving an efficient division of moral labour or an efficient division of moral responsibilities, it kind of requires a kind of collective enterprise. If we want to achieve the efficient division of labour, then we require different kind of agents, different parts of the system to each play their role. So in the medical case, if we want a division of labour where doctors act in the interest of their own patients and kind of health funding authorities ensure that healthcare resources are distributed most efficiently. Maybe this is the most efficient division of moral labour, but to achieve this efficient system, we need both the health funders and the individual doctors to kind of do what they're supposed to do in this efficient division of moral labour. If the health funding authorities are actually completely negligent and are not doing anything to ensure that healthcare resources are distributed justly, then it's no longer clear that doctors should kind of also not think about the resource allocation implications of their decision, because that will simply result in no one thinking about healthcare resource allocation. If there was no one ensuring that healthcare resources were distributed justly, then we might think that actually individual doctors should think about the healthcare resource allocation implications of their decisions. And a similar worry will apply to scientific kind of system. If we don't think that scientific regulators or those that are in a position to kind of push science in different directions, if we don't think that they are kind of fulfilling their responsibility to ensure that science serves the public good, then it's no longer clear that kind of individual scientists can appeal to this idea of an efficient division of moral labour to justify not thinking about it themselves either. That will simply result in no one thinking about whether science is being used in the public interest. And I think this is kind of a relevant consideration, because I think one could quite plausibly argue that at the moment science regulators, science funders and so forth are not kind of fulfilling their responsibilities to think about what effects science is having on the public good, at least in relation to possible misuse of science. It's kind of, so think about science funding bodies, for example. It's standard for science funding bodies to kind of think when deciding whether to fund a particular proposal about what the positive applications of that knowledge or that project might be for wider society. But it's not standard for funding bodies to think about what the possible negative applications of that research might be for society. A few UK funding bodies